I'd like to first of all acknowledge the Songhees First Nation on whose territory we're meeting. And it's also my pleasure to welcome Mr. Andrew Bell, who's the host of Business News Network's Commodities and Market Call program. So we have like a television celebrity from Toronto. And let's hear it for Toronto, yes. He's traveled all the way from all the way from Toronto to moderate tonight's discussion and to introduce and moderate the illustrious panel members that we've brought together here. The panel members include quite a diverse spectrum of opinions and learning and background and interests. Our panel members include Grand Chief Ed John from the BC First Nations Summit and First Nations Leadership Council, Mr. Gavin Durham, the President of the Association for Mineral Exploration in British Columbia. We have the Soda Creek First Nations Chief Bev Sellers, the Chairwoman of First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining. And we also have Professor Bonnie Doherty from the Harvard International Human Rights Clinic speaking. And of course, we have all of you and the ideas that you're going to bring here tonight. And at the discussion that we're having here tonight, it's been pointed out to me by the organizers, the First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining, that they want this to be a discussion, not a debate. So it's not going to be a forum where people tear each other apart and then at the end of the night you vote on winners and losers. We'd like to all come out of this winners. The reason that the First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining and the Environmental Law Club here at the faculty are presenting this event is to try to achieve something that hasn't yet happened in British Columbia, a public exchange of positions and discussions on mining issues by all sides in front of an audience of diverse interests. And they tell me that they did not expect to produce solutions this evening, that that's quite frankly not going to happen, but that they hope to achieve better understanding of the challenges that British Columbia faces in terms of mining, and perhaps have this as the first step in more meaningful discussions that can lead to solutions and better ways of doing things for First Nations and for the province of British Columbia. I think the fact that we have been able to obtain the participation of such a diverse and distinguished panel is a good sign that there is a general desire to move beyond some of the conflict and impasses that have marked mining in British Columbia for so many years. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Anne-Marie Sam, who's a member of the Nikalsi First Nation, and she's going to begin our evening with a prayer.
So Creator, be with us tonight as we all come together to hear the wise words that are here in front of us. Thank you for bringing us all together, and that we are here to share and to learn from one another. And we have a responsibility to always remember that we have a responsibility to the land, to protect the land, and to be here for the land and to speak for the land. I thank you for this time, and to protect everyone that is here, that has traveled to be here, and that we just are here respectfully.
Thank you. I'll now turn the evening over to Mr. Bell, and the instructions on what I'm supposed to say here state, let the dialogue begin.
Thanks a million, Professor Sanborn. What a good-looking bunch of people. Much more healthy-looking than a similar crowd in Ontario. I mean, walking around Victoria today, amazing to see all the outdoor stores. My wife said she traveled business class the other day on a plane. She doesn't often get to do it. I don't either. But she said she felt like crying a little when she sat down in the big seat and the flight attendants were so nice to her. And I do feel like crying a bit when I come out to BC, because it really is incredibly beautiful. I know you're sick of hearing that, but I got off the plane yesterday and it was misty, it was nighttime, and you could smell mint in the air. wild mint growing in the. It's just an incredible place. So I won't drone on. You're not here to hear my rambling. It's hard for me. I don't have a teleprompter in front of me, so it's hard. I'll tell you one quick story. I had a producer, the nicest lady, very polite, very refined. And one time I was supposed to read stuff that was on the teleprompter, and I was trying to improv. And she finally lost her patience. She said, in my ear, you hear the producer in your ear, read the prompter, you moron. So later, anyway, but I'll try and do the best I can. So thanks for having us here, Professor Sanborn, Dean Greshner. I'd like to thank in particular Naomi Kovac and Holly Pattison of the Environmental Law Centre and the Environmental Law Club for doing incredible organising work. As Professor Sanborn said, it's supposed to be a dialogue. There has been, there's even been threats of violence, I know, involving mining projects in BC. There's been a lot of confrontation, a lot of frustration on the part of First Nations and also the mining industry. And it's been making national news. I mean, the rejection of prosperity was a huge story for us on Business News Network. It was a huge story internationally, and I know that's still a sore point, the prosperity gold mine. So I'm really excited to hear from our speakers today. Unfortunately, the BC government are a no-show tonight. We asked them to come, and they didn't have time to come, so unfortunately. So the order of speaking, I'm going to ask Chief Bev Sellers to come up first, if you would. Chief Bev Sellers of the Hatsul First Nation and this year's chair of FNWARM. Chief Sellers.
Thank you. I've got a bit of a cold and my voice was cracking today, so I hope I can get through this without it. Otherwise, I'm going to have to turn away and have a big cough. So thank you all for being here tonight. I would like to acknowledge the Songhees Nation, in whose territory we are meeting. I would also like to thank the University of Victoria Environmental Law Club for co-hosting this event with FNWARM. So there's a saying that there are only two things in life that are certain, and that's death and taxes. While the First Nations women advocating for responsible mining is telling you that there's another certainty in British Columbia, and that's that First Nations will always be in our territories. We have been here for thousands of years, and we will be here for thousands more. And that is the only way forward. That is why the only way forward is to work with us. So once a mine is opened in our territories, it will always be there. And we are the ones who will have to live with the after effects of the mines long after the mine developers and money made from the mine have gone. However, when First Nation WARM began to talk about the idea of this forum, we knew that if we were going to work with each other, we had to begin with a substantive public dialogue involving all sides. We hope this evening will be a start. There have been stories focusing on specific projects or statements by one side or the other, but what we have not seen is a serious analysis and acknowledgement that, first, there are deep-rooted underlying problems with the mining system in BC. Second, these problems are a major impediment to responsible mining development in the province. Third, the current system, with its conflict and uncertainty, has cost jobs and opportunities for responsible, sustainable growth. And fourth, if we want jobs and economic growth, the system needs major, genuine reform. Tinkering with the system will achieve nothing. Trying to streamline it to ram through projects will only make matters worse. FNWARM members, like the BC Leadership Council, and we have the Leadership Council represented here today. We have Grand Chief Ed John, we have Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, and we have Regional Chief Jody Wilson. And like the BC Leadership Council and the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council, and we support them, we believe that if done properly and responsibly, mining development could provide desperately needed jobs and revenue for communities. But mining cannot override all other considerations. Virtually all mining projects, abandoned, existing, and proposed, are on our traditional lands where we live. They are far away from towns and cities, and most British Columbians do not get to see them. Yet, our position should not be so hard to understand. Who would want a massive open pit mine and toxic tailing ponds in the midst of their own communities? People intuitively understand that water must be preserved and protected from pollution. All living things depend on water for survival. There would be no salmon fishing or farming, or indeed any business, if not for water. And any parent can empathize with the need to ensure that development does not bring with it major social problems such as drugs, alcohol, crime, and ill health. Any property owners can imagine how they would feel if a company just showed up and started digging up their land. And you know, they have the right to do so, and then destroy it with either A, no compensation, which has been the history of what has happened to First Nations in BC, or a take it or leave it government offer of some token payment based on whatever it feels like paying. The only difference is most British Columbians have to imagine what that would be like, while as First Nations, we live it every day and have done so since the first gold rushes. Mining is the new gold rush. It does not help that some political and industry proponents resort to ignorant claims, for example, telling the public that a beautiful fishing lake that was featured on tourism brochures is a worthless, muddy pothole. It causes real harm when they respond to genuine First Nation concerns with racist statements that First Nations don't care about their kids, are lazy, and just want more money. Statements that were actually made and reported here in BC last year. There are bright spots. The Taku River Tlingit Agreement stands out, and we know of some companies in BC who recognize the need for change and are working with First Nations to try to develop partnerships and address cultural and environmental concerns. But sadly, these are exceptions and nowhere near becoming the norm. As women, mothers, and community leaders, FNWARM members came together because we have all experienced the worst side of mining and want to turn this around. And each FN member can tell you a horrific story of things that have happened to them in their communities, but that's not why we're here tonight. We want to change that so we can all move forward and have a positive future for everyone. We have seen communities abandoned because of ongoing pollution from abandoned mines, and have even had those responsible for this try to set up new operations. They just changed their name. We have seen companies offering cash to community members to talk to them so that they could pretend they have engaged in meaningful consultation. We have been subjected to negative local media coverage and community comments encouraged by companies who wage PR campaigns to portray their intentions as the answer to everyone's prayers. We have seen this in some cases lead to violence against our children. We have even seen a member of her council falsely sued by a company. The ridiculous case was eventually dropped, but not before it forced the community to spend more than $90,000 on legal fees, money that would have been far better spent on pressing social needs. We have experienced divide and conquer tactics that have sought to turn community against community. Most have yet to see one dime. Most Aboriginal communities have yet to see one dime from mining projects that have scarred their traditional lands for decades. And promises of future sharing have too often proved to be pitiful, arbitrary offers. The already rejected Prosperity Mine project has become such a lightning rod across BC and Canada, not because it is the only problem First Nations face, but because it is the epitome of those problems. The company is now back with option 2, which last year it stated was worse for the environment than option 1. And that the province and industry are helping them push this simply adds insult to injury. Across the province, understaffed and underfinanced First Nations are swamped by an ocean of claims and proposals in which bad projects float to the top. This is our reality. The reality for the province and for industry is that, unlike the past, First Nations can no longer be ignored or bypassed. If we want sustainable, productive mining in BC, we have to find a way to address the root problems that are preventing this from happening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chief Sellers. I'm going to ask Gavin Derom to join us now. The opening remarks, and Chief Sellers, you were right on the mark there. They should be around 6 minutes, if you can keep it to that. Gavin is president of the Association for Mineral Exploration, BC. So he's here representing the companies at an earlier stage who are really exploring, staking out, just checking out what minerals are there, but also setting up the early engagement with local First Nations.
Well, thank you for having me. I certainly appreciate the opportunity, and I think this is an amazing, hopefully a turning point in our history together. I think tonight represents the first of many, many future meetings and dialogue. I first also want to acknowledge that we are in the Songhees First Nation, and give respect to the Grand Chiefs and Regional Chiefs that are here tonight. So I think that's very, very important. The host, UVIC Law, thank you very much, and to the First Nation women advocating responsible mining. I know some of you quite well, and we've had some very good discussions in the past, so thank you for this opportunity. And I really do believe this is hopefully a turning point. I represent the Association for Mineral Exploration BC, and just a bit of background quickly, it's a member organization, about 4,000 members. There's about 330 corporations, and what we're doing is exploring and developing mineral resources, not just here in BC, but in Canada and around the world. We've been doing so as an association for approximately 100 years, and there's one key event that I invite everybody in this room to that happens in January called Mineral Exploration Roundup. And in fact, in terms of First Nation engagement, we were one of the first conferences many, many years ago to encourage and then welcome First Nations at such a mining conference. I think a key couple of points I took away from Chief Bev Sellers' comments was that there are challenges, absolutely, and I wouldn't want to talk about each example necessarily, or I'm not even aware of all those. But I think the key is I think there's hope in the examples you gave of where First Nations and companies are working together, and the folks I represent are early stage prospectors and explorers that we're certainly encouraging to engage early and engage often, and engage in a very meaningful way, in a truthful way. I think at the end of the day, and this is kind of my philosophy about exploration and mining, and having been at UVIC and frankly quite concerned about the environment, and still am, it's the reality that we're all, in a sense, explorers and miners, because we're all using the mineral resources, so we all have a shared burden and responsibility, and a shared opportunity, in fact, and that's what I hope we can talk about tonight a bit more. Maybe quickly a little bit about the state of the industry. Some of the folks here might not be aware of exactly what we mean by this modern day gold rush. So right now there's over 300 projects active in British Columbia, about 20 mine projects underway. And that represents the beginnings of a modern day gold rush. We did have a drop in 2008 and 2009 given to the economic crisis, but there's a lot of folks that are very interested in exploring in British Columbia because we have amazing mineral potential and we have amazing geology, and we're encouraging them to explore, but explore responsibly. We are challenged by land access and use policies, and I think that's frankly why we're here tonight, to kind of talk about that, obviously. And a big aspect to that is Aboriginal consultation. And consultation, and this is a legal forum, and I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me, but is obviously a responsibility of the Crown. So it's government to government, First Nation to the Crown. And we respect that, and we're certainly not government. And often industry does find itself wedged in between the discussion between First Nation governments and the BC government, and not to mention the federal government. But what that all means at the end of the day is permitting becomes challenged, and the opportunity may be diminished, not just for the exploration company, but also for the community and for the First Nations themselves. quickly, in terms of the province, this is a vast province, and those that have explored it, it's incredible how huge this province is, upwards of 96 million hectares. It's amazing how big it is. In terms of mineral title, there's about 14 million hectares that are now in mineral title. In terms of actual disturbance, about 50,000 hectares over the last 100 years have actually been impacted by mining. In terms of exploration, we're essentially trying to find that needle in the haystack. The opportunity to explore vast areas is important because nobody knows where that next big deposit is. But in reality, in terms of mining, it's quite localized and indeed obviously a major impact in a localized area. And hopefully there's, I guess in terms of the balance between societal needs, there's an appropriate trade-off there in terms of the benefits that we all need to have accrued. And so I think that's going forward part of our discussion tonight. In terms of what AIM is doing, and I think it is quite different than even, even 10, 20 years ago. I don't think we would have had a discussion like this even 5 years ago, frankly. So I think we are in a new era. The association I represent has a committee called Aboriginal Relations. We have guiding principles, which I won't read them all out, but I'll touch on them shortly. Years ago, we produced something called the ACE Guidebook, Aboriginal and Community Engagement Guidebook. And it was one of apparently a Canadian bestseller. And it gave examples of success stories where things are operating well, because I think we can dwell on negatives and we can dwell on very bad examples, and we should learn from them, absolutely. But we need to move forward and focus on positive success stories. We do a significant amount of outreach and education, capacity building in local communities in joint venture with the Mining Association, with First Nations, and indeed with the First Nation Energy and Mining Council, which Chief Sellers just referred to, and they are responsible to the First Nation leadership. And we're very hopeful about that growing partnership going forward. Specifically, and Zoe might talk about this as well, but together we've worked with First Nations in something called the BC Aboriginal Mine Training Association. So again, how can we, as industry, support government initiatives to build capacity, support First Nation governments to build capacity, and further everyone in the process. I won't go through all 8 guiding principles, although if you ask me later, perhaps I will. I'll just give you the sense of it, though. AIM-ABC recognizes that building respectful and sustainable relationships with Aboriginal peoples will assist its members in having access to land and resources, security of the tenure, access to services and labor, and to operate according to standards of good corporate practice. And these guiding principles are built on earlier versions many, many years ago. And, they're guiding principles. They're kind of motherhood statements. And as we all can appreciate, it's the reality, what actually happens on the ground, what's actually going on that's important. But I think we need to agree generally going forward that it's important to have goals and aspirations and guiding principles that hopefully we can all agree to, and then we can look to refer back to as your touchstone. So if it's not happening, let's agree as to where it ought to go, and let's get into the detail and into the actual case histories and work together to make it that much better. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to the questions.
Thanks very much, Gavin. And once again, that's Gavin Durham. He's president of the Association for Mineral Exploration BC. That's the kind of the earlier stage companies. I'm now going to call on our next speaker. It's Grand Chief Ed John, and he's one of the elected executive members of the BC First Nations Summit.
Is your recording okay? I don't want you to miss a word. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples whose ancestral lands we are on. I'd like to also thank the University of Victoria Environmental Law Club for hosting this event, and to FNWARM for continually bringing forward opportunities for dialogue, and I think it's really important. I was thinking when I came here, first time I was in this building was talking about Indian land claims, British Columbia, and it was then called the Judge Begbie Building. Now, those of you who know Judge Begbie, he has the dubious distinction of making the decision to hang 5 Chilcotin chiefs who were defending their territory. Anyways, we kind of raised some objections at the beginning at that conference, and I understand that was called the Fraser Building. Thank you. Thank you to UVIC. I wanted to also to thank you to Andrew, and I know you don't represent the Bay Street bunch, but or even the House Street bunch for that matter. But you know, economy of this country and this province is really important, and in particular, the economy in this province is dependent on the resources, whether it's fisheries or forestry or water, minerals, incredible wealth potential, but also incredible wealth that has been generated in this province, land as well. I like to remind people that James Douglas in 1859, on February 14th, issued a proclamation that said that all lands and minerals therein in British Columbia belongs to the Crown in fee. Simple proclamation by a simple governor, took all the lands and territories and resources from First Nations, just as a simple declaration. Anyways, I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues, the Regional Chief Jody Wilson Raybould, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, Chief Marilyn Baptiste, and members of the chief from my community. I saw one of my communities. I told her she won by a landslide Dolly, I called her. She won by 1 vote. Not this last election, but the previous election, Dolly Abraham from Takla. These issues are so incredibly important to First Nations and to ourselves entirely in this province, the many peoples that make up this province. The standards that are used to engage First Nations, there's been a very big debate about that. What will these standards be and what will these standards look like? And I was listening to some of your 8 principles that AIM has. Well, some of us actually were part of AIM at one point. It was a different AIM. It was called American Indian Movement. Stuart, you remember that? And it was a bit of a radical period in the history of our peoples, and it was really around what we then call land claims. And the standards of engagement, I referred to the proclamation of 1859, February 14th, Happy Valentine's Day. I don't know whether it was called Valentine's Day back then, but that was it was that moment in history of our province, and I know for sure that our people did not consent to nor agree to the transfer to the Crown in fee of our entire territories in British Columbia, First Nations territories. And so there's been, over this period of time, tremendous developments, and there was that history is really remarkable in that it's a history of assimilation, it's a history of marginalization, a history of dispossession, and a history that we live with now. One of those remarkable features of that history was the Indian residential schools that Beverly, we were talking about, and congratulations on your upcoming new book, I guess, on Indian residential schools. Why would I talk about Indian residential schools? Because it was part of the pattern of Crown conduct. And part of that pattern was to take children from our communities over 3, 4, 5 generations and to assimilate them, as the Prime Minister said in his apology in 2008, to kill the Indian in the child. And that pattern is unfortunately still very much with us today, or a part of that pattern is very much still with us. Troy, you've been studying this, you know this well. The pattern is this. You were talking about the issue of consultation, and I wanted to talk about the standards of engaging First Nations. And the pattern is this, that Indigenous peoples in this province do not exist as peoples, and nor do they have any rights until they are able to go to the courts and prove it. That is the standard that exists in this province now. It's not something historical. It's not something that's happened 100 years ago or even 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. It exists right now. We know that because we see and we're able to understand the pleadings that governments file in the courts. We're able to see and read and understand the legal arguments that the Crown lawyers present. And that is a standard that's there. So somehow the courts have managed to establish some minimum standards called consultation and perhaps accommodation. And we've been engaged in international standard setting through the United Nations. We have now a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, copies of which are available, the lady in the green right here in the back there. Copies of a small booklet that we've been able to prepare that and we disseminate. And I really want to thank the University of Victoria for engaging in this and encouraging this dialogue. And I really encourage the 27 post-secondary institutions in this province, colleges and universities to help in this dialogue that's so necessary in this province. Because at this point, we are still at that place where the underlying material legal rights called Aboriginal rights or Aboriginal title is not accepted by the court. Accepted by the governments. And the courts haven't gone as far as to say that Aboriginal title as a legal interest exists in British Columbia. The Gitxsan and now the Chilcotin people are perhaps have gone the furthest on this issue, and I want to recognize Val Napoleon, who, a dear friend, who I want to congratulate you as being the first Indigenous person, first Indigenous woman, the first person to graduate with a PhD from this law school. Congratulations. I'm so proud of her achievement, how far she's managed to get. I knew when she was running the small community law education center in Hazleton, and now she'll be teaching in this pretty important institution, and hanging with the best of the intellectual minds that we have. But we all knew you had that brilliance in you. But the notion of standards. The Declaration has 46 articles, and there are minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples globally. So the issue of mining and the impacts of mining, for example, or any resource development is a global issue. The issues that we talk about, I dare say, are issues that Indigenous peoples are talking about globally. The impacts that they are seeing from companies who raise revenues or raise monies on the stock exchange on Howe Street here, one of the major fundraising capitals for mining development globally. Mining exploration and mining development happens right in our backyard on Howe Street in Vancouver, not just on Bay Street, but Howe Street. I think Howe Street outstrips Bay Street actually in raising capital. Maybe I'm wrong, but maybe Andrew. Yeah, all the small companies that are raising revenues for mining exploration activities globally. So these standards are critically important, as I said, for the survival, dignity, and well-being. And we do have some suggestions that we've made to the government and to industry. We're looking and hoping to engage with the government on a new relationship table so we can talk about these really important policy issues. We do have... Beverly talked about land use planning. In the Haida and Tlingit cases, one of the really important developments and the concept that the court talked about was engaging First Nations at a strategic level. And the Haida and the Tlingit recently have a land use agreement in place that provides a foundation for the Tlingit and the Haida to engage government in relationship building and resource development, so that the First Nations have a say in what goes on in their territories. It's saying that if you're coming into our house, you better knock and introduce yourself and tell us what your plans are. And then we'll determine whether or not we like what you're planning. But you should talk to us. And that's the idea around consultation. It's not just some mere formality that you wave a piece of paper under our nose and go ahead and do whatever you want. It's still happening now with exploration companies and mining development companies. Unfortunately, that's the reality, and we are dealing with it. Environmental assessment processes, I saw that Canada and British Columbia on the Enbridge proposal, that the pipeline proposal that's going through the territories of my people in the north, there's a joint arrangement for an environmental assessment process. And we're saying, you know, you have to include us in this process. You can't just assume that we're some kind of stakeholders in the process. We have genuine legal, fundamentally recognized and affirmed constitutional rights through and into our territories. Mining, we're talking about free entry reforms that needs to be reviewed. This is an archaic method that exists in this province, that we need to take a look at that process. We're talking about the creation of a First Nations, province-wide First Nations mining policy, and to talk about what benefits accrue to First Nations. You know, the very first thing that First Nations always talk about are responsibilities. And they're taught in the legends and the stories and the history of our people, the responsibilities that we have. The first right that we have is the responsibilities that we have. We talk about Aboriginal rights. Well, the first of those rights is the responsibilities that we have in our relationships to each other, but in relationship to everything that's on the land, as Beverly was saying in her presentation. So I want to conclude by referring to Article 25 in the Declaration, because I think it's really fundamentally important, and we fought for every word in the Declaration, the 46 articles in the Declaration and the 24 preambular paragraphs. We were there every step of the way for some 20 plus years, fighting for this Declaration as a minimum set of standards. You were looking for some principles that you have, guidelines. Adopt this and use it. Work with us on the basis of this Declaration and the principles in it. Article 25 reflects what Indigenous people have to say about their relationship to each other, but in particular, as Beverly talked about, in relationship to the lands, the territories of our peoples. It reads, Indigenous people have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters and coastal seas and other resources. And here's, to me, the most important part of it, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. And that is always the teaching that we have in our communities, in the legends that we have, and the teachings that are provided by the elders, and the fundamental cultural beliefs that is reflected by First Nations in our communities right across the province. So I wanted to share those ideas with you, and to really welcome the opportunity for this dialogue, not the debate, but the dialogue that's so fundamental with industry and with government. It's really, for me, disappointing that the government of British Columbia chose not to participate here today. It's to, you know, they have this huge job strategy that they're putting out there. They're talking about creating 8 new mines. They're talking about the Gateway Pacific to China. Well, I'll tell you, we're going to be in China on the 21st to the 28th, and we're going to be talking about our stories, about who we are, and what the fundamental legal requirements are for Chinese government interests or Chinese private business interests when they're going to invest in British Columbia. There's $1 trillion at their disposal that they need to invest, and they're looking globally, and they're looking into Canada, and they're looking to British Columbia, and they're looking for investment opportunities. Our First Nations communities are saying, you're going to invest, you should talk to us about investment in our communities, in our territories. Talk with us. Don't just talk to the companies and don't just talk to the governments. You need to understand the legal uncertainty exists, and we can provide that certainty, but you need firstly to make sure you understand the legal landscape and the political landscape and talk to us. So that's part of the message that we have, and I know that this is not just a message that I'm delivering. I know that the Union of BC Chiefs, the BC Assembly of First Nations, our National Assembly, our National Chief will be a part of that delegation, as well as representatives from the Leadership Council to convey that important message to the world's emerging economic power. So thank you for...
Thanks so much, Grand Chief John. I mean, it's unavoidable. I do kind of represent Bay Street in the way, you know, BNN, we live off Bay Street, and I have to admit, I like miners. You know, they're a pretty optimistic bunch. They're a swashbuckling bunch. But, you know, when I hear Chief Sellers or Grand Chief John talk about, you know, these mines aren't going away. And would I want an open pit mine near my house in Toronto? No, I would not. And so, you know, it's the reality on the ground is very different for First Nations peoples affected by these projects. Our next speaker is Zoe Younger, who's VP Corporate Affairs at the Mining Association of British Columbia. And these are the big operators, the ones who are either building mines or operating mines right now. Zoe.
Thank you very much. I would like to start by acknowledging the Songhees for welcoming us to their territory and allowing us to meet here today. I agree with Gavin that this is and can very well be a turning point for the discussion between First Nations and industry, and quite frankly between people about mining in British Columbia. One of the things that's really interesting is we talk a lot about consultation being the responsibility of government, and we talk a lot about whose job it is to do consultation. And I think, you know, there's strong legal arguments to be made. Not being a lawyer, I might get them wrong. This is a dangerous room to venture into that territory, I'm sure. But the legal obligation to consult rests with the Crown and is between the two levels of government, between First Nations and between the Crown. But the responsibility for the relationships and the responsibility for cooperating and living together on the land is ours. It is all of ours. And we all have an opportunity here to come together and talk about how we do that together. Because I think while those discussions happen between governments, and they're very important, and they are ongoing, and I spent a number of years as a treaty negotiator, and I can tell you that the work is hard, and it is long, and it is really important, and it's work that we need to continue to do. And while that work is carried out, we as mining companies, individuals from the law practice, First Nations, we all have an obligation to figure out how we're going to cooperate to get the best that we can get out of the land in British Columbia. And we may all have different visions for what that looks like, but I think it's really important that we have the kind of dialogue that I think we're starting here today, and I'm really excited about that. I want to talk to you a little bit about a program that we've introduced in British Columbia that I think takes us in a new direction as well. Over the last 3 to 6 months, we've been implementing a program here in British Columbia called Towards Sustainable Mining. It was introduced by the Mining Association of Canada as a national accountability framework that has now gained international recognition. What's unique about this accountability framework is it's not the mining companies monitoring themselves. It is externally verified, it is publicly reported, and it is an accountability framework that encourages our industry to strive to be better in all of the things that we do. I hope that we're not as good as we're ever going to be today. I hope we're better tomorrow. And I hope we're better next week, and I hope we're even better than that next year. And so what this framework does is this provides us with a toolbox, and it gives us some of the opportunity, and it gives us some of the guidance through its protocols focus on some key areas for improvement and continuous improvement and continuous growth in our learning and in the way that we do business. And one of the fundamental protocols is on community and Aboriginal relations. And that protocol talks about how we can strive to do business better. If we're going to be in the mining industry, if we're going to be in the mining business in British Columbia, that is absolutely by far the top of the list in terms of what's important to companies to get right. And I share Chief Sellers' view that, it's important for everybody that we get it right. And I think we have an opportunity to work with that protocol and to work with the public and our community of practice to improve continuously on that. Other protocols include reclamation, so that we continuously think about and grow and improve our strategies on how to reclaim sites when the mining is finished and we've taken the ore out of the ground. How do we treat that land afterwards? We're thinking about that. We're staying up at night thinking about that. It's something that is actually really important to us. One of the things that's really unique about mines is that they are where you find them. You can't put them somewhere else. So when you find a deposit, when an exploration company finds a deposit, that's where it is. So the first thing that needs to gel is the relationship and the goals and the values that are going to be brought to that resource, and how and if and when it gets developed. And we need to do that in conversations, and I think we have an opportunity to start those conversations now in a way that's a little bit different than maybe what we've had in the past. There's no question that relationships matter, but there's no place where relationships matter more than on the land. Anybody who's been working in resource development in British Columbia over the last 150 years understands that having First Nations as partners, as meaningful partners in projects and development, is a cornerstone for success. And I know that our member companies that I've spoken to about this all strive to do it. And not everybody can do it exceptionally well all the time. Not everybody gets it right out of the gate. I mean, we have been learning continuously since probably since we first got here and found a community, or a large community of people that we wanted to work with. And so I think there's opportunities here to continue to collaborate and to continue to work together and to continue that dialogue and to continue to do things differently and do things better and to learn from our mistakes and not be painted into the corner. I can tell you, I did a lot of things when I was 19 that I sure hope I don't do again. And I sure hope I don't carry that baggage and that legacy into my adulthood and into my 50s. I hope I can learn and grow and improve, and I hope that the people that I worked with or that I dealt with then can appreciate that I evolve and that I grow and that I learn. And I think that's something that we need to give all of ourselves and our communities an opportunity to do, is to learn and grow and evolve and make mistakes and learn from them and turn the page and start a dialogue in a different way. So with that said, the Mining Association of BC does represent the producing mines in British Columbia, and I'm actually really excited about the opportunities that lay before us. Not just the opportunities in terms of mine development, but the opportunities to develop meaningful partnerships that are different than we've seen in the past. We now, as an industry, employ more Aboriginal people than any other industry in British or in Canada, with the exception of the federal government. And I would like to see that statistic change to say we have more Aboriginal partnerships in this industry. Employment is important, partnerships are meaningful, and partnerships build communities. And having First Nations be a part of developing resources in their territories gives them the tools to create successful, healthy communities for themselves and to be autonomous and to be the people that they choose to be. And I think that's really important as we go forward. I think as we start this dialogue, there will be questions, there will be things that we learn from each other. There will be times when we don't disagree. I think the most important part of this shift is the shift towards being very respectful and to recognize that at the end of the day, we are, in fact, all going to be here. We are here to stay, as we've heard sort of mentioned in several keystone speeches from judges, from others. We are all here to stay, and we'd like it to be a collaborative and cooperative relationships. So with that said, we at the Mining Association have supported, along with the Association for Mineral Exploration, the establishment of an Aboriginal Mine Training Association. We open our doors to questions, and we continue to support our member companies as they strive for continuous improvement, not just in terms of how they engage with Aboriginal communities, but also how they do the business that we're in, which is mining. And we continue to work with the provincial and federal and municipal governments to develop a regulatory process that is robust and meaningful and inclusive and allows for the kind of dialogue that needs to take place for everybody to be able to feel confident that the resources are being developed in a sustainable and meaningful and in a way that shares the wealth and the benefits fairly across British Columbia. So with that said, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Zoe. I don't even like to think about things I did when I was 19. Can't always remember, actually, a lot of the stuff I did. Anyway, but finally, we've got an American visitor. Great to have you here. It's Bonnie Doherty from the Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic. And you remember last year, they came out with that report on the mining industry's relations with First Nations in BC. And one of the headline-making conclusions was there's an unfair burden on First Nations. They're overwhelmed by applications from oil and gas, logging, mining. They just don't have the resources to evaluate and deal with this flood of applications. And we're talking really a gold rush. It's a global gold rush. Chile alone is spending about $70 billion over the next 8 years building mines. China will not be denied. So, Bonnie, if you could come up and maybe summarize and give us a few remarks, what you've found about mining in BC. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. And thanks for the warm welcome for American visitor. Particularly grateful to FNWARM and to the University of Victoria Environmental Law Club for inviting me to this event. And it's some familiar faces and some people that I've emailed and phoned with over the past couple of years, so it's great to actually meet you in person. My involvement in this issue began, as Andrew said, with the 2010 report bearing the burden that my clinic put out, which is a combination of field research and legal analysis. And there's a few points I want to draw out today for our discussion, more on the legal side. First is what legal rights are First Nations entitled to under the law. Second, how they are bearing an undue burden because of mining, and that runs counter to those rights. And third, what can be done about it, hopefully in a very collaborative effort in the spirit of this conference. First, both international and domestic law grant Indigenous peoples the right to special protections for infringements on their land, and that particularly in this case refers to mining. International Aboriginal rights come from binding treaties that Canada is party to, as well as from the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which the Grand Chief mentioned a few minutes ago. Canada signed that declaration shortly after a report came out, and we welcome that decision. I'm not drawing, that wasn't intended to draw a correlation there. First Nations have the right to decide what happens on their land and what happens to the resources of their land. And they also have the right to practice their cultures, which in this case are, for First Nations, are inextricably linked to the use of the land. Canada, in turn, has a legal obligation to protect these rights and to ensure that others protect them. The rights come not only from international law, but from Canadian domestic law. And that is an important fact that I think resonates more than the international level, but both are important. There is an extensive and complicated body of Supreme Court jurisprudence that relates to the interpretation of the Canadian Constitution Act, and it permits infringements on First Nation land, but sets up certain safeguards. There's several cases, but notably the Haida case from 2004 mandates consultation with an accommodation for First Nations whose lands are affected by activities that could adversely harm them. In this case, it can be applied to mining. The case requires, quote, good faith efforts to understand each other's concerns and to move to address them. So together, the international and domestic law call for heightened scrutiny of any such projects. The second point is looking at how it's been implemented in practice. And despite the legal rights, as Andrew mentioned, First Nations have borne an unfair burden of mining in BC. And this occurs at every stage of the process, from claim registration to exploration to production to cleanup of abandoned sites. There certainly are some protections for First Nations in BC and mining laws, but in our research we found that they generally favor industry. There are effects in three main areas. First is inadequate consultation with First Nations. For example, online staking, that individuals or companies can register a claim on First Nations land, but they don't have to notify the First Nations at that time. At the exploration level, they are required to submit a notice of work to First Nations before receiving a permit. And while that is a good requirement, there is only 30 days for the First Nations to respond, and they don't have the adequate time or resources to make a proper evaluation of a proposal. Second is the cultural, environmental, and health impact of mining. Just for one example, is First Nations, some First Nations observed decline in the wildlife in their territory. This is caused by deforestation and new roads, for example, and has caused some nations to change their diets, and it has affected hunting, which is, again, linked to their traditional culture. In particular, I think it's important to recognize the cumulative impact of mining, and it was often repeated to me during my research that in some cases, many exploration sites can be, to put together, can be as dangerous as one large open pit mine. Finally, the lack of benefits to First Nation communities have been troublesome. There's no doubt that many First Nations have benefited from mining in terms of job opportunities and revenue sharing, but research suggests that in many cases the benefits have not outweighed the burdens. Finally, I just want to conclude that we believe the situation should be changed so that the burdens and the benefits are spread more evenly across the stakeholders, from First Nations to mining industry to government. And our report lays out detailed recommendations, which I can talk about in the Q&A, but just to highlight the most overarching ones, is there's clearly a need for law reform, and that reform should address the 3 points I just talked about. That should involve First Nations more in decision-making, they should increase in protections for health, environment, and culture, and encourage a better balancing of benefits of mining. Our recommendations are directed not just at the government, but also at mining companies. We encourage them to voluntarily, as you've talked about some of those principles, voluntarily to work with First Nations to increase discussions at all stages of the mining process, to work out benefit sharing plans. And we also call on First Nations to clarify more what they want. Who would be the best person within their community to be consulted about in a certain project? What areas of land do they want to be protected? And what types of economic benefits are most important to them? Clarification of these rules will help all stakeholders, and we believe that if they work together, as this panel is promoting, they can best achieve a system which balances the burdens and benefits of mining. So I look forward to your questions, and we'll turn it back to Andrew, though, right now.
It's funny, America's had such bad press in recent years. You do hear Americans, it's almost an apologetic tone, but, you know, it's still in many ways, you know, the leading country of the world. You know, I mean, your military are one thing, but in many ways the contribution to science, and we won't go there, but, you know, and even, you know, I remember Ralph Nader said tort law is the thing that protects the public, and that's a great contribution the American legal system has made. So, no, I mean, you can sue companies, they'll listen to that. Anyway, so, and Steve Jobs, yeah, we've all, created those addictive products. It's an amazing country, America, and a great neighbor. Anyway, now, we've got about 50 minutes. Now, I know you guys have better questions than I could ever ask. Can I just ask a very quick question, if I may, to Chief Sellers and Grand Chief John? Obviously, the industry and the government either implicitly or explicitly say, you're blocking progress by delaying mining projects. There could be jobs for natives, there could be jobs for non-natives. Do you accept that? I mean, are you being obstructionist here by insisting on it? Yes. I'm being kind of devil's advocate, but how do you react to that, say, Chief Sellers?
Yes and no. I mean, we have families that we need to provide for as well, and we want jobs like anybody else. We want to be able to look after our families, but we don't want mining at any cost. We're not going to allow that. Like I said, we're going to be in our territory for thousands of years, and you know, once there's a mine in place, whatever and I was at a conference in Lake Louise a couple of weeks ago, and one of the presentations was on Murphy's team, Murphy's A team, Murphy's B team, and some black swans. And Murphy's A team are things like erosion, and I don't have the list here, but there's erosion and all kinds of things. And these are perpetual agents on Murphy's A team, you know, that are looking to destroy the best closure plans that a mine will have. And so if anything happens, it's going to leach all of that poison into the ground. And if Murphy's A team doesn't destroy the mine, then Murphy's B team, which is floods and earthquakes and things like that, are going to, you know, destroy or, you know, wreck the mine or whatever, all the safeguards that were put in place. And so we're looking to make sure that we're not left with that, but at the same time, I think there's responsible mining. We're not looking to block mining. We're looking for responsible mining, and in order to do that, you have to work with First Nations people. And one of the other things that they kept saying over and over at the conference in Lake Louise was that the First Nations people know the land, and they tell the mining companies, you know, this is what's going on in the land, and they said that they're amazed that science proves it. And I'm like, geez, we've been here for thousands of years. Of course we know the land. So those are the kind of things that need to be considered. So like I said, both yes and no. We will stop those projects that are going to destroy the land, and we are willing to work with our mining companies to go ahead and have responsible mining.
Grand Chief John, would you like to add
that? I think one of the primary interests that First Nations have is to protect the land and to defend it. I think that goes without saying. That's not to say for a minute that we're not interested in jobs or development, but there's got to be certain things that are important first. Gavin and Zoe talked about consultation, and you know, the way it's been said to us is that if you don't talk to us and if you don't include us, the answer will always be no. And so, you know, some of the points that the recommendations in the report here by Bonnie, I think, really are important policy initiatives that allow a place of comfort for First Nations. And the Taco River Tlingit, for example, in their land use agreement with the province, provides that foundation of comfort for the communities. In that case, the Tlingit, and certainly we need to see more of that. I think if there is one fundamental achievable work that needs to be done, are these land use plans with First Nations that are not developed simply by government and industry, municipalities, but these agreements between the First Nations and the government, in this case British Columbia, that outlines the nature of engaging First Nations in their respective territories. I think those standards are really important. The International Mining Council, which is representative of mining interests globally, and the Canadian Mining Council is a part of that, including the BC Mining Association, is now considering the concept of free, prior, and informed consent as part of the standards that they adopt. They've looked at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They understand the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. They've done some work. We've been speaking with them through the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. So certainly that they're aware of it. The International Finance Corporation, IFC, the World Bank Group, recently adopted the free, prior, and informed consent as a new standard that will take effect in January 2012. Their standard was free, prior, and informed consultation, and they've moved into the issue of consent. How widespread it's going to be and how widely used it is, I don't know. That really only means this, that Indigenous peoples, in our case First Nations, have to be involved in a decision-making process. And then that's the standard that's there, and they have to be able to say no if they must. Is that obstructionist? I don't think so.
And you're throwing it right back at me. Thank you. Now, Naomi, I think you're personing the microphone. And, can I throw one question at the representatives of the industry? I mean, we hear this word consultation, and Grant Chief John said it can't just be waving a piece of paper under somebody's nose. Would you guys be willing to accept a First Nations veto on a project? Can we get down to brass tacks? Would you guys be willing, the local Indigenous people, if they say no, that's it, we'll give up and go somewhere else?
I mean, I think the easy answer to that is no. And I think the more complicated answer to that is that we don't make the law, we follow it. And it is up to government to decide how it's going to have the relationships with First Nations and how it's going to cooperate with First Nations and get their feedback and incorporate them in decision making. It's not up to our industry to fix a problem that exists between the Crown and First Nation governments from hundreds of years ago. It is our job as an industry to respect the people who are potentially affected by the work that we want to do. It is our job to engage First Nations in a meaningful conversation about their views and their thoughts and about the benefits of a project and how they can participate and benefit from those projects directly. In terms of whether or not we can define what the governance structure looks like, we don't have that kind of legal authority. We can only follow the laws that are set for us, and we do our best to do that.
Gavin, would you like to add anything?
Sure, and what I might just, I guess, just reflect on is the comment I made earlier about how industry often feels, stuck in the middle between governments, plural, and moving ahead with the projects. So, and obviously the larger community. So, I mean, ideally, if you look to what we would hope to see in the future, and we're starting to see a few examples, but it's about having certainty and predictability in terms of the process. And, even there's some case studies that exemplify if you can hopefully have the federal government and the provincial government and the municipal government, and most importantly in this context, First Nation governments, actually make one decision once and relay that to the public and to the industry. I mean, wouldn't that be fantastic? So it's back to like, what are we trying to achieve right now? And this is back to why we're keen to see reform as well, because right now it's disjointed. You might have a very strong opinion from the First Nation government, which is respected, but there's no sort of legal basis there and so forth. You have a federal government maybe having a different opinion than the provincial government. So it's quite confusing, and it doesn't allow for that opportunity to encourage investment and develop a project and share benefits, et cetera. It kind of gets killed right at that point. So, whether you want to talk veto or non-veto, I think the goal is to have one decision made, that's based on good science, it's based on consultation, and to get that decision sooner than later. I mean, everybody has things to do, and so let's get on with making a clear decision once, and that includes First Nation governments, and I think that's where we want to go in the future.
I mean, Chief Sellers, would that be a thing that would work for you, to have one approval process with the federal government, the province, and the local First Nations involved?
I guess it would depend on what the process is. I mean, I'm not going to say yes, we'll do that. I mean, every project is different, and we would have to see what that process would look like. What we're saying today is that it's not working. I mean, one of our members today found out that their graveyard has been staked online. Somebody legally has the right to go and mine in their graveyard, and you can bet that the First Nations people are not going to allow that. So I think, we're looking at land use plans, and the mining organizations have to come to the First Nations. There has to be no-go areas in our traditional territories. Right now, it's wide open. It's just wide open. Anybody can go mine anywhere. And that doesn't respect our interests, and so that has to be taken into consideration first.
Is anyone burning to ask a question? Oh, I think we've got a few takers, Naomi. Anyway, sir, you at the back had a question, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is what I think. The lady from the mining organization said that they just follow the law that our governments make. The problem is that the mining industry and the corporations in general control our governments. And they also own the media. So there's a tremendous power there that ignores what the entire public wants.
So the question there is that, in fact, de facto, the people with the big checkbooks control the government, and so it's a bit disingenuous to say that we'll just go with what the government says. Any reaction, Zoe or Gavin, to that? Thank you.
Wow. There's a debate about the government structure in this province that is well beyond the scope of, my expertise. I mean, I know what my experience is working with government. I think everybody has their own views about whether or not government is representative of them, and I think people have their own views about whether or not government is working. I respect that we may not all have the same view of that.
Gavin, I mean, there's a case to be made that corporations' voices are heard most loudly in the provincial and the federal capital.
Well, I mean, I suppose that's true to some extent, although, and I see some elected officials here, and not to mention elected First Nation chiefs. And I think one thing I reflect upon is, democracy is a participation activity, right? And it's remarkable how few people get involved and how few people vote and so forth. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think, there's some truth to that for sure. But I'd also suggest that, there's a lot of apathy out there as well. And maybe it's because of some of those issues or what have you, but I think, I'm still, I guess, young enough and hopeful enough that there's a democracy that we're participating in, and we all have to be part of it, and we have to, get involved, understand the issues, be informed, and vote.
This is also on the comments of the two mining representatives, but it was like I understand that government has a lead role in setting policy, but it also seems like an easy answer to just defer to their rules when these hard questions come up. And I know that businesses like to innovate. Why can't you innovate past these government rules, especially if you even admit that the government is not doing a good job and we have all these conflicts? Wouldn't it be good business practice to move ahead?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're doing towards sustainable mining. We are setting the bar higher than government is setting it for us. We are setting a bar that reaches beyond. We are taking our direction from a steering committee that includes representatives from First Nations, from industry, from environmental organizations, from universities across Canada. And they're telling us what the goals are for us, and they're telling us what our objectives are. I encourage you strongly to go to the Mining Association of Canada website and look up towards sustainable mining, read the protocols, look at the program. We are doing things in our industry to go well beyond what government tells us to do, to go well beyond what the minimum requirements are. The notion that industry constantly aims for the lowest possible score or the lowest possible burden is just simply untrue. It really is.
Gavin, did you want to throw something in there?
Maybe I'll add two quick, examples of that. And I think when you do a full analysis of the exploration and the mining history in this province, you'll see challenges, and you'll see some amazing projects that have produced a lot of wealth and capacity for all of us. But you'll also see innovation, and I think, and you don't see that in every part of the world in terms of other explorers and other miners. I think Canada, and especially British Columbia, led the way, in fact, in the late 60s and early 70s in reclamation. And there's something called the Technical Research Committee on Reclamation, and that was the function that Chief Ev Settlers was actually at. And it's remarkable how much innovation has been undertaken and trial and error, mistakes were made and so forth, but it was all about the goal. And you can imagine late 60s, early 70s, the culture of trying to change the world. It was all about, can we actually have clean water coming out of a mine site? Can we actually have fish downstream of the mine site? Can we put into closure plans that make sense? Can you plant, vegetation onto the waste piles, etc.? Those are the technical challenges that were addressed with a tremendous spirit and in a leadership way through the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. So I think we have lots of good examples that, as a British Columbian, I'm quite proud of, irregardless of representing explorers and miners, because not everybody was doing that around the world. And so I just encourage you to, learn more about it and then get involved and, challenge the science, challenge the process, etc. But I think BC has some very good examples. The other one quickly is on the safety side. Tremendous effort in this province to conduct exploration and mining in a very, very safe way. And I'm extremely proud, and especially the miners who did all the hard work. It was leading edge stuff. Unions came together with governments and corporations and reduced incidents and accidents and fatalities in a remarkable way. It's an incredible case study of how to work through some pretty challenging issues. And I can tell you, having worked at a mine site and having been part of investigations with fatalities, it's a very emotional and trying experience. But the outcome of, okay, what have we learned and what can we do better is the whole point of the exercise. How can we prevent this in the future? And I'd hold up, British Columbia and BC as the epitome of how to do it right in terms of coming together, like we're doing today. In fact, it's not always easy, but if we have these discussions and then we get to solutions that are actually practical and work, and then we can look at either tweaking or reforming policies and structures and so forth, because we've actually had the dialogue that will give us a good foundation.
That's fighting talk. Because I know some of the panelists would take issue with some of the stuff you said there, Gavin. Grand Chief John, did you want to throw something in?
Thank you. I think safety in the mines really is it shouldn't be an issue. You need to have safety for workers. It goes without saying. But that's not the issue here. The fundamental issue that I think we're addressing, and of course is about the place and the role of First Nations and industry in that, and the relationship with government. I heard both of you saying that veto, no, and it's not supported by the law. We never talked about a veto. That was his question. And what happens is when industry or government or media want to put the First Nations down, the first question they put forward is veto. Use the word veto because it's a very loaded term. And as soon as you put that out there, say, how come those Indians can have a veto? They're not entitled to it. Who are they to think that they can say no and have a veto to these projects? What the Supreme Court of Canada said was consultation is a requirement while the underlying issue of the material legal right called Aboriginal title or Aboriginal right is being resolved. There's a requirement, a constitutional requirement for you to consult with them. And the consultation has a range in it, and including consent, where the project is a big project perhaps and will have severe consequences. Then the issue of consent becomes alive. Is that a veto? It is a veto if they say no. Consent is important, and it's not the same as a veto. And so I think it's a veto is always a loaded term, but I want to tell you that it is supported by law. It's in the case involving the Haida and the Tlingit in the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada includes the issue of consent. And you can't say it's not supported by the law, and I know that some of your lawyers that are involved in this, we fight them in the courts and they keep on arguing the same losing argument, but they keep on bringing it up and they keep on losing, and the mining companies keep on paying them.
Naomi, I think you have some questioner. Oh, you've got a bunch of questioners there.
Thanks. My name's Amy Crook. I work with I have the honor of being a member of FNWARM, and I also work with a small nonprofit called the Environmental Mining Education Foundation, who's working to help FNWARM and the First Nation Mining and Energy Council develop what we hope is part of the solution. So my question actually is to Galvin and Zoe. We have heard the frustration of the communities for years on the lack of capacity, the issue of, as Chief Sellers pointed out, bad practices, contamination left behind. And what we're in the process of doing in conjunction with Calvin and several of his brilliant law students is to create a best practices mining code based on a lot of the cultural values that have been put forward tonight and under the sustainability criteria that was developed by the Kemess North Mine Panel. Really cutting edge. And my question to you is, we've looked at every characteristic, every line of the BC Mine Code. And I'm sorry to disagree with you, Gavin, but what we've done is we've taken a legal look worldwide at best practices on Indigenous lands and compared BC's law in every aspect, in every stage of the mine cycle. And we've compiled it. And what we're doing right now with FNWARM and the other First Nations leaderships is bringing that to a point where we can say, here's some real areas of improvement. Here's something very specific that's a best management practice that we see from around the world that we're not seeing in BC. And my question to you is, are you up for it? Will you work with us? It would truly change the lay of the land and the lay of the law.
Of course, we're up to it in terms of sitting down and finding out exactly what it looks like. Because I mean, back to the code, the power and the strength of that code is that it's always changed based on good input and something that was agreed upon and made sense. And so it's adaptable, it's flexible. That was the purpose of it, right? It's never going to be perfect. And I think to Zoe's comments earlier, it's lifelong learning. You improve. So absolutely, be happy to look at that, and the members would sit down and kind of find out in a practical sense what works and what may not work, and we can have a good discussion about that. I think a really good example, and Chief Ed John brought it up, was land use planning. Like in a practical sense, yes, you have to get the context and the procedure right in terms of law and policies and so forth. But in a very practical sense, on the ground, I often find land use planning, an example was raised with the TRT, and I personally worked with John Ward, for instance, on moving that forward. And is industry completely happy? Is government completely happy about it? And I imagine some of the TACU aren't all necessarily happy about it. But the point was, it was a very healthy process over many years that looked at a lot of considerations. And so, because that informs back to, I think, what Grand Chief is speaking to about how do you get to some assemblage of support for a project. In fact, like how can we inform the companies as to where it's appropriate to explore and possibly develop a mine. That seems reasonable, but land use planning is the underlying scientific and cultural and community support to drive that in a practical sense. So when it's happening, and there's more to do, but I would hold up the TRT as a good example of a process. And again, nobody's going to be happy necessarily all the time, but it was a good, solid process, and that's what we're learning from. So if it's that kind of dialogue and discussion, and this code can help us, help all of us, frankly, great. We're all better off.
Naomi, I'll leave it up to you. I have one question from the floor that I've been asked to ask, and just very quickly, I know we're throwing a lot of questions at the industry, but I just got to ask you, Do you accept that really the system has to be reformed wholesale, guys? Because I think some of the First Nations, you're saying that the whole approach has been wrong up to now. Do you accept that basically it's back to the drawing board on this? And that the corollary to the question I've been asked to ask is, what are you willing to give up a big chunk of the profits you might make off mining projects? Are you willing to pay here, if you know what I mean? So it's a two-part question. Are you... Do you accept that the whole system has to be just looked at again? That it's creaking, that it's not working?
Okay, how about this? I'll address the first part, and maybe Zoe can address the second part.
Fair enough.
You know, and I've been fairly outspoken about, you know, reform in a few areas as well. And it goes back to, you know, having a process, whether it's permitting or environmental assessment, that actually makes sense for everybody involved, frankly. So environmental community, First Nations, and obviously industry, government, et cetera. We don't have endless time and money and resources to review projects. And so I think on that score, yeah, there's an opportunity to you know, rework it and in certain specific areas perhaps you know, seek wholesale reform. And clearly in terms of the First Nation end of things, it's obviously critical. So I think we need to roll up our sleeves and have that discussion and work together on what it would look like going forward. You know, I think the intent, for instance, of the Environmental Assessment Act was pretty good. I mean, the folks years ago when it was, you know, created had some pretty good ideas. You know, let's look after the environment, let's consider the impacts, let's mitigate them where possible, let's consider how that's going to affect others, arrive at a decision whether to go forward with permitting or not. I mean, it's good intentions, and we can build on that. So I think we have an excellent base to build on and make sure First Nations are included in a much more meaningful way. And that's why I reflected earlier on my comment, like this is a new century, folks, and we're not going back. And I hope it's not going to be the kind of the conflict we had with unions in years gone by. I think, and there's many examples where we're working very well with First Nations. So I'll leave it at that, and over to you for the tough question.
I guess, would you be willing to accept that BC is a much less profitable area to mine than other areas might be?
Oh, well, I think that depends on the project and what part of the province you're working in, and a lot of details, how it compares to other jurisdictions in terms of profitability. I mean, the companies have that wisdom in their coffers, and I can tell you that they're interested in doing business in BC, so there's something that's drawing them here. To the question around reform, you know, any process that is predictable and clear and consistent and inclusive and science-based and includes First Nations and the public and you know, all the people who have a vested interest in the outcome is one that our industry will look at and, you know, make a decision about whether or not participating in the mining industry in BC is therefore affordable. But certainly changes to the process are not unwelcome, provided that there is an ability for companies to understand what the rules are and to be able to participate in a predictable and affordable way.
We've got so many questioners there. The guy with the beard?
Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here. My name's Troy. I'm a first-year law student. I'm also a member of the Tanaka Nation. I'd like to thank the Coast Salish people for allowing me to live in their territory and to study, and to thank the organizers for the event and the panelists and for the dean for everyone involved with this. Industry has been getting a little bit beat up tonight, and I'm not going to change that too much, but I would like to say that that it is the government of British Columbia who should be sitting up here as well. And in that regard, I do believe that there are some members of the opposition here tonight, and I'd like to thank them for being here. And if things continue the way they are, they may not be opposition for much longer. However, I would seriously hope that the members of the opposition, those people who would form the next government of British Columbia, actively listen to the Indigenous peoples of this province when it comes to mining in British Columbia. Because Barrett didn't do that, Harcourt didn't do that, Glenn Clark didn't do that, and neither did Ujjal Dosanjh. As a member of my community, every single day, $8 million worth of coal is exported from my territory. I've been here for 36 days in Victoria, and since then, $270 million has come from my territory. And we are the only community in our land that doesn't receive 1 penny from that resource. And for industry to have any assertion that the standard in British Columbia is somehow better than anywhere else, or equitable, or fair, or just, simply is not commensurate with the experience of our community. And when we cannot drink the water from the St. Mary's because of the mine, the world's largest lead zinc mine that was in Kimberley for generations, or when we hear the trains going through our community every 4 or 5 hours from the Elk Valley, and we know that we don't have any homes. There hasn't been a new home built in our community in 15 years. Meanwhile, like, I'm an uncle for 30 people, all little kids, and where are they going to live? And I think it needs to be acknowledged that industry does have the veto. What industry wants is what happens. And if industry and if the province of British Columbia would only share and agree to work with Indigenous peoples, I wouldn't have to be in here at law school. Darn it. We could have, it could be the best place on earth. But until that time, that we don't have to be living in such systemic poverty on a daily basis, and when there are absolutely no resources to maintain our language and to support our culture, I will tell you this, that industry should be very happy. And I guess this is where the question I'll go with is with the two chiefs, that Indigenous peoples have chosen thus far a strategy of engagement, whether or not it's through the courts or through the political process. But I don't believe that choice strategically is a given. And that I believe the gentleman on the end there mentioned the concern when it came to labor unions in the past. It's more, the black sheep in my family is me for going to law school. You know, it's more likely for our kids to go to jail than it is to go to post-secondary. And if for some reason that there was a political consciousness to focus our attention towards the state rather than having the violence inherent within our communities, I think the industry should take heed and really, as the one person mentioned earlier, take some leadership. $8 million a day is enough to go around.
That's an amazing figure. Bev Sellers, Chief Sellers, the questioner made an interesting point that you've tried engagement, and I think it's fair to say you're saying that it hasn't worked. What have you guys done wrong? Could you talk about some things you feel that you should fix?
I think, you know, it's a terrible thing to say, but a number of years ago, my husband got into trouble for saying, and they took it out of context, and he was talking about the newcomers coming to this land, and he said, considering everything that has happened, maybe we should have killed you all. And he got in big trouble for that. But, you know, that's what Native people are. I mean, I always say that our greatest strength as Native people is sharing. Even we're the poorest of the poor today, and we share in our communities. But our greatest weakness was in share. I think could be made an argument that we shared as well, because we helped the people get established in this land. And then, you know, you talk about all of these laws and everything that have been made with the exclusion of Aboriginal people. When the Indian Act was made, they didn't go out to the communities and say, we're making this law, what do you think of this? They made it without any input from Aboriginal people, and they were racist laws. And Aboriginal people didn't get the vote in BC until 1949, and the federal vote until 1960. You know, and we were oppressed, made to stay on reserves and not allowed any role in how the land was developed. And by the time we got the vote, you know, all the lands, the policies and the laws for the lands were made. Now we're fighting that. We're trying to be included. So I don't know if it's us who have done something wrong. You know, our human rights were violently violated because we weren't allowed to be a part of the economy. And we're trying to fix that. And, you know, Aboriginal people, I mean, our last resort, one of our members, Chief Marilyn Baptiste, got in trouble when she said that one of her elders, you know, had a gun and that she wasn't going to miss. But that's the desperation we face. We don't have millions of dollars to go to the government and say, this is what we want. We want to go out and do this, or we want to go out and do that. We don't have the money to pay for that kind of lobbying. So in desperation, our people stand, you know, with their guns. And, you know, that we haven't used it, but they feel that strongly because it's our economy. That is our economy. You think of it, you know, the mining companies think of it in a different way. They come in, and it's the clash of cultures all over again. You know, the mining companies come in and they look at the bottom dollar, and it's the Aboriginal view, you know, that the land supplies you with everything you need to survive versus the non-Aboriginal view that you have to conquer the land. And that's what we're trying to create, a balance here. We're desperately wanting to create a balance because we want to keep our way of life. And there's a saying, I think it's a Cree saying about, how does it go? Only when the last fish has been poisoned, only when the last tree has been cut down, only then will you realize that money can't be eaten. Or something like that. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a balance for our kids and our grandkids, but not just our kids and our grandkids. In protecting our territories, we're also protecting the land for your grandkids as well. So I don't think it's us who's done anything wrong.
Grand Chief John.
If it's okay with you, I'd like to ask my colleague, Grand Chief Stuart Philp, to answer that.
Why haska halt Ipisinak and Chaya Squeeze as you? I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Coast Salish people in general, and in particular the Songhees people. I would like to thank those responsible for organizing this dialogue and express my gratitude for this opportunity. I just want to make a couple of points. Number one is we're headed for serious conflict in the province of British Columbia, and we need to know and understand that. And I don't think that we can sit on our hands and say, well, we don't make the law, we simply follow the law, because that just speaks to the status quo, and it doesn't do anything to avoid the conflict that is looming on the horizon. With all due respect, I agree. The province should be sitting here. And also not industry associations, but the actual companies. The BC First Nations Leadership Council, of which there are representation here, have a very high-level safety protocol agreement with the RCMP and the municipal police forces in this province. The purpose is to facilitate relationship building and to ensure the safety and well-being of not only our people, but all of the officers in the field. And we have an excellent relationship at the top with the senior leadership of the police forces in this province. But it doesn't mean that there isn't individuals that have died at the hands of police in jail cells, that have been grievously assaulted, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the mining associations can sit there, they can talk about grandiose, lofty principles and best practices and all of those kinds of things. They make these wonderful statements about the need for progressive change. But when the rubber hits the road is when a particular mining company goes forward with a project and disregards all of those principles and best practices and says to us, we have a right to do what we're going to do, and we're just going to go ahead and roll right over the top of you and do it. And that's the situation that exists in this province. Ed talked about the outstanding Aboriginal title issue. There's no clarity. There's no mechanism or means to reconcile those differences. So it would be nice if the mining associations had the regulatory authority to make sure that their members did in fact abide by the principles and the practices and so on and so forth, but they don't. So that's why we have the problem in the province of British Columbia. And the comment about there needs to be individual innovation shown by individual mining companies, I believe that that's our only hope at the moment. And in some cases that has happened. And it's, it's shown incredible results. But there are companies that are exactly the opposite. And I'm not mentioning any names here, but I think we all know who I'm talking about. That are a case study in how not to proceed with the project. So I just wanted to make those points, and why, Lim Lim, thank you.
Thanks so much. Oh, Gavin, please. Gavin.
Very powerful and moving comments, and I think maybe just to address it in a general sense, and back to the gentleman that's taking the law school here and trying to further himself and your community, I think that's admirable and important. And back to so what can the associations do? And all due respect, Grand Chief, yes, the mining companies aren't here per se, but I'll give you an example of a couple of things. So I think the gentleman left about how do we influence government, and we're acting as advocates and lobbyists in certain things. One particular example that we did as associations representing the companies within is to lobby and advocate for resource revenue sharing of the mineral tax in BC. And maybe it's a little too late or and what have you, but it's actually happened, and it's never happened anywhere in the world. So the mineral tax that the Crown collects is now shared, not with 203 First Nations yet, but I mean, I can sit here and look you in the face and say I would sure hope it would be shared with 203 First Nations pretty damn soon, because they only have two, maybe 2.5 now that are signed, and working with Chief Shane Gofferson, for instance, in the Kamloops Indian Band, and we're writing letters together on how we might want to support the BC Aboriginal Mine Training Association, et cetera, to build capacity. But it's based on industry's influence with government, and I think in a very positive way, we lobbied for resource revenue sharing of the mineral tax with First Nations. And I think that's a great example, and there's only a couple right now, but why not have 203 in your community? Because clearly it's not happening. So, I guess maybe I'm an optimist and hopeful, and I don't want to see that serious conflict, and I hope we all would want to prevent that. So what can we do to avoid it? We look at the positive examples. Maybe there's only 2, and we build on that when we make 200 of them.
We have another question. I think you, sir.
Hi, I'm Scott Fraser. I'm the MLA for Alberni Pacific Rim, and I'm the Aboriginal Affairs critic for the opposition. And Doug and John are here too to learn and listen. It's Troy, so that's why we're here. So the BC environmental assessment is woefully lacking. It was gutted in 2003 by the current government, who aren't here, which is unfortunate. But and we saw that starkly by the conflicting assessments that happened between the provincial and federal government with Prosperity Mine and the attempt to kill Fish Lake. That's still ongoing. The throne speech happened this week in the province, and the Premier announced through that throne speech 8 new mines to be opened in the next 4 years, and wouldn't disclose which mines they were, where they were. But I guess we can be assured they're in traditional territories. And in keeping with, Ed mentioned Section 25 of the UN Declaration, but Section 32, which deals with free, prior, and informed consent. We found out in the meeting earlier, Chief Sellers, I know you were sick on Wednesday there, sorry, we missed you, but we did also meet with First Nations women advocating responsible mining, and thanks for that. But it sounds like there was no consultation with First Nations around that announcement of these mines opening up. So if we're not getting any respect for free, prior, and informed consent and the UN Declaration from the provincial government, or maybe the federal government, I'm sure we're not seeing anything there either. I guess I got a question for Bonnie, because Bonnie, you touched on this. Is there any I mean, this is a lens that I think the world is expecting everyone to use now. So the UN Declaration, is there any teeth in the UN Declaration if governments, even if they've signed it, just ignore it?
Thanks for the question. Well, the UN Declaration itself is not actually binding law. Declarations aren't binding law, but it's been very, very widely accepted as a document. So I think that it established principles that there's standards that are being set around the world. So I think, while Canada's not officially obligated to follow that rule, it faces strong sort of peer pressure to do so. So I do think they're important standards. And I'd also mention that with regard to many of the issues we're talking about today, Canada is party and legally bound to certain other conventions that provide many of the same protections. So they still provide the right, for just to name a few without getting too legal, but the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights both establish at some point rights to determine, to be part of decisions involving use of your land and the right to enjoy culture. So those rights are established in binding treaties. The Universal Declaration is a hugely important document, but regardless of what you think of that, those rights are protected elsewhere. And just one other thing, based on, you mentioned the jobs plan that came out recently. The international law that Canada is bound by allows states to so-called progressively realize certain rights. And the idea is that certain economic and social rights are can be very expensive to implement, so you have time to realize them. But it also very explicitly says you cannot go backwards. And I realize there's not that much information about the jobs plan yet, and so I don't want to specifically rule on that, but it does seem like in some ways it may be a step backwards. And so that's something to keep in mind as well.
Bonnie, can I just, or Professor Doherty, I'm sorry, I just ask you a very quick question. Inter Pares is a group partly funded by the United Church of Canada, and they said in a report, I think it was 2 years ago, that in Colombia the normal practice is the military go in and just clear people off the land under the guise of looking for guerrillas. So why, I'm going to be a devil's advocate here, if I may, why wouldn't you go and investigate Colombia where, there's death squads, whereas in BC, there's severe problems, people's health has been ruined, but there isn't organized killing. Why would you not go to somewhere where there is to do your investigation?
Sure. Well, first of all,
I'm actually not trying to be facetious or anything.
No, I know, yeah. Well, first of all, our clinic does work around the world, and we've done mining in places, Africa, not done mining, we've done research on mining in Africa, South America, not Colombia in particular, but other places where violence is an issue, Asia as well. So certainly those issues shouldn't be neglected. In terms of why British Columbia, first of all, international law applies here, and your own domestic law applies certain Aboriginal rights. And I would think that just because certain situations may be worse doesn't mean you should ignore the situations at home. And it still violates certain Aboriginal rights law. It's certainly a problem. We've heard a lot about the problems tonight. And it's also a warning. And I'm not saying, by any means that Canada's going to bring in death squads in the next 2 years. By any means am I saying that. But it is a warning that things can get worse. And it's better to take action now than to let things get worse. And taking action can be a preventive measure as well as fixing a current problem.
This fellow's been very patient, the guy with the glasses here.
Mashitro Shoje Bruce Hornsby, Han Wichin Huchin, Tondak Wichin Huchin. Hi, I'm Bruce Hornsby. I'm from the people of the river, the Han people, the Tondak people, the people who live at the place of the Hammer and Stones, the mouth of the Klondike River, Dawson, Yukon. So, of course, we have a whole history of being devastated by the first Klondike Gold Rush and at the center of the second Klondike Gold Rush. But I'm going to leave that. I'm going to try and keep these focused more generally because I know you guys are all experts on the British Columbian situation. So I guess one of the big things I'm really concerned about, and I think that the Honourable Chief did touch on a bit, is this whole issue of the disparity and the focus upon the westernized economic system. that you know, and maybe I'll share a little bit of a story here about the discovery of gold in the Klondike. The reason those Aboriginal men were out there is they had a vision. They had a dream of salmon covered with gold flakes with eyes of $20 gold pieces. So they thought, you know, it's a day to go out fishing, because that's where our economy always was. And you know, I think what one of the difficulties I have is industry talks about engaging in Aboriginal people, Indigenous communities, but the industry is not ready to hear a no. They want us to sign off on whatever presentations they go forward, and go ahead. They're not ready to say, you know, that some areas are too sacred, too powerful for our economy, that these aren't going to be the go. We support mining. We support the mining and gold fields. But right now, we're fighting like tooth and nail with all our gumption to protect the peel. We got an 80% land use plan from the commission, and industry is fighting that. So I guess what I'm hoping to, what I'd like to say is, industry, put your money where your mouth is, and if you want to work with us, part of that's being able to say no, and part of that is respecting that our economy, that our economic development, that our economic rights does not necessarily mean economic development within the Western sense. It does not necessarily mean a mine. It can mean the right to harvest fish and harvest wildlife within our traditional territories, and to do that in a safe way that will protect it for our future generations. Masi Tro, and I'm really sorry if I turn this into a debate. I was always told by my elders and my chiefs not to pull any punches when speaking. Masi.
Thanks very much. We have to wrap it up. I was going to ask our distinguished panelists if you wouldn't mind making just one or two brief remarks to sum up maybe something you heard tonight, or anything surprising you heard, or any message you'd like to leave with us. Gavin, could I ask you to start, if you wouldn't mind?
Okay. Well, first off, thank you very much for having me and having this panel organized. So certainly do appreciate it. You know, I'm still taking away a good degree of hope and opportunity to work with First Nations and others in terms of making a better industry and a stronger communities in BC. So I'm still very hopeful. I'm probably never going to change on that. And I think this has helped you know, shape the discussion going forward. And we're going to be reaching out to you know, many other First Nations as well, in terms of you know, getting some practical solutions to this. And some of it might be policy changes, legal changes, what have you, but tonight's been very good. I appreciate the time. And the one last thought, and it's I think it's back to what I reflected on earlier, is the fact that we all need and use mineral resources means we all have a shared responsibility and a burden to bear. And so we have to work together. We're on one planet. We need the mineral resources. How do we do it smartly, responsibly, and equitably? That's our challenge, and we all have a role to play in that.
Thanks, Gavin. Zoe?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I echo Gavin's words of thanks. It has been an interesting evening to be invited to. I think what I take away from this is that we have a lot of work to do if we're going to focus on cooperation and not conflict. I think we have a lot of thinking to do about what that means to each of us individually and what it means to us in our respective collectives as we identify ourselves. I think one of the things that I take away from this is that we have a lot of work to do to build trust amongst ourselves and between ourselves, and I can tell you that our industry is committed to doing that. And we know it's a long road. It's taken us a long road to get here. I ask that the people in this room take the message back to the people in their communities that we're here because we wanted to listen to what you had to say. We've heard what you had to say. Some of it was harder to hear than some of the other comments, for sure. And we take that away and we're going to think about, and I'm going to think about, and I'm going to talk to my membership about what is it that we can do differently? What is it that we can do better? Not just in terms of mining, because that's something we all have a shared responsibility, as Gavin has said, to do better. But how can we have this dialogue better? How can we have a dialogue that is solution-oriented, that is based on cooperation and respect and collaboration, and that allows us to benefit from the bounty this province has to offer with its natural resources? Thank you very much for taking the time tonight, and thank you again to the Coast Salish, to the Songhees for welcoming us here. And thank you very much to all of you for taking time out of your evening to be here with us and to ask us the difficult questions, because I think it's only through asking those difficult questions that we make progress. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Professor Doherty?
Thank you, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me up here and for the audience for the warm welcome. Just, I guess, 2 points. One is, it came up over and over again, the idea of principles and standards and guidelines. And I think that I would encourage you all, whatever, whether you're for industry, First Nations, or government, to look to Aboriginal rights law, as we talked about a minute ago, whether it's the Universal Declaration, whether it's international treaties, or perhaps with the most resonance here, Canadian constitutional law, as a standard. And I think if you can agree on that standard, that can help inform any law reform that goes forward. And second, I like Gavin, I'm an optimist, and I think that, I'm optimistic that there can be collaboration, cooperation among the groups. Certainly I, would be happy to work to help that in any way we can in our, outside of Canada position. But I definitely wish for the best for all of you, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks, Professor Doherty. Chief Sellers?
So in my opening comments, I went into some detail as to what the mining story in BC looked like from the point of view of First Nations on the front line. The intent was to try to explain what it is like for us, what we're striving to protect and why, and to make clear the challenges that we and the province and industry have. We cannot have dialogue without understanding, and we cannot find solutions without facing up to the challenges. Our sincere hope is that we have achieved a little bit of both tonight. I want to thank all the panelists for their contributions to the discussion tonight, and all of you in the audience for caring enough about this to be here tonight, so thank you for coming. And of course to Andrew Bell for agreeing to travel across the country to serve as moderator. Thank you. And I hope this is not the end of our dialogue, but rather just the beginning, and perhaps next time the government will be here with us. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to report that we have representatives from the Say Out Nation, including some elders, and they're going to close the proceedings for us. So thank you very much, everyone.
My name is Vic Underwood Jr. I'm a member of the Say Out Band, which is only 14 miles from here. When we deal with issues of any kind, in our family law, our community law, the older ones always taught us, about love, respect, honor, trust, and honesty. And, and we always have that feeling. When we close our table for the night or the meeting, we always sing our family song. Our family song represents that we as a family will unite as one, have one heart and one mind. And tonight we will support, anything that'll help our First Nations people, because we've been hurt too many times. And actually we learned this because we both went to residential school, and now we're learning how to live our culture, sing our songs. And our family song, we're gonna close the table, it'll show we have one heart and one mind. And the third part of our family song, we clap our hands. We want you to clap your hands, because it'll pick up our spirits to where we need to go and how to be. So clap your hands with us when we sing that part. Okay?
I'd like to say a wholehearted thank you to the organizers for inviting us to come in as First Nations people. We are elders and residents here at UVIC, in case some of you don't know. And we do spend a lot of time at First People's House. We don't live there, but we're there. Feels like we live there. Okay, we'll see you. And feel the song in the depths of your heart. Because, you know, I think it comes down to our people feeling peace and harmony within, and feel that and put that into the land, and the land will give it back to us. We have a spiritual teaching about that. Looking for peace and harmony is to empty our own hearts of hurt and resentment and anger. We'll see him. Siam, Haichka, Aichka, Hacha, Shushukli, Haitsepka, Salsila. We thank you today, Creator, for this time that we've had together. We pray in a good way for courage to go forth and do what we have to do, to negotiate peace and harmony, Creator, amongst all the parties, to protect our land as we really need to right now. We pray for healing in our land, Creator. We pray for healing amongst our people. We pray for the poverty amongst all nations, Creator. We say a special prayer for the women who organized this gathering tonight, Creator. We ask that we have complete protection and guidance throughout this whole process. O Siam Nasiya, Siam Nisjelacha, O Siam. Ah!